And what I'm going to be talking about today is an aspect of a sort of ongoing research project about Las Vegas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that I began some years ago, focusing in particular on Protestant women missionaries. But I thought, as a kind of change of pace, we'd start with about a minute-long film clip. It's actually off of YouTube, so hopefully that won't violate any copyright laws. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can everybody see that? Okay, yes. And it's just going to be about a minute long. Okay, you may recognize the video. It's from a classic movie. This is from John Ford's famous 1939 movie Stagecoach, and it shows a group of women aided by the sheriff running out of town, a prostitute named Dallas, also a drunk, and although I'm not going to show you the rest of the scene, they also sweep up a notorious gambler, and they force them all onto the stage headed for Lordsburg, despite the fact that the stage is about to be attacked by Apaches. And I like it because my introduction to, or my early ideas about the temperance movement came primarily from Hollywood films. And so I was a little taken aback when I started doing research on missionary teachers here in Las Vegas in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I started running into references to the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Las Vegas. And I was intrigued because there seemed to be strong connections between the temperance movement and the Temperance Union and Protestant missionaries working for the Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopal, and Baptist churches here in Las Vegas in the 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. So I was intrigued and I wanted to know more about it. And so it's in this context that I began a couple of years ago to poke around. Now, those of you who know me know that my primary research agenda is in the history of Latin America, in particular 19th and now 18th century Venezuela. But I've been working for a number of years on this project about local history. And so I wanted to find out more. And this presentation is sort of a work in progress. It's pretty rough, and I'm still looking at and trying to answer a series of questions. And so in the end, I've got perhaps as many questions as answers. But I think it's an interesting story, and it's one that, again, the tangible remains of which are still around us down to the present. So with that as a kind of introduction, let's talk a little bit about the temperance movement. Now, again, a lot of people will have images or understandings of the temperance movement that derive largely from movies. Again, the women of the Law and Order League in Stagecoach, or for those of you who are not quite as old as I am, perhaps, a 1965 movie, purportedly a comedy, called Hallelujah Trail, the sort of dramatic tension of which is provided by a group of temperance women who are trying to prevent a wagon load of whiskey, or actually a wagon train load of whiskey, from arriving in Denver. And they set out to do this, even if they have to smash the casks of liquor themselves. And it evolves in very comedic ways. It's a movie that, from the vantage point of almost 60 years later, looks pretty dated, and there's some aspects of it that are overtly racist. But again, I saw this movie when I was a kid, and so this, along with Stagecoach, formed kind of my impressions of militant women's organizations in the 19th century West. And so this is why, when I started seeing references to the Women's Christian Temperance Union here in Las Vegas, I was interested in and thought I'd explore some more. And as I started to do a little bit of research, and again, I'm still in the early stages of it, I ran into other sort of competing images of militant women from the West, some very positive, some very negative. And so here we have a couple of cartoons from the mid-19th century, one depicting the temperance movement as heroic female knights going and attacking, smashing barrels of alcoholic beverages in the defense of society. Another sort of competing image shows a well-dressed, refined woman setting out to do great things, leaving behind the menfolk of the house doing housework and taking care of kids. Again, the idea in this is that women who venture outside the home and get involved in political causes are, in some senses, not true women. And there's an article, an editorial published in a Kansas newspaper in 1868 that referred to women involved in temperance and women's suffrage as hermaphrodites. That is, they look like women perhaps, but deep down they're not really women because they're entering into a male sphere. So these are some of the notions about the Temperance Union as a national organization that I started to run up against when I came in, began to get involved in this. And so the historical question that I'm kind of wrestling with, and that's the focus of this presentation and of the research that I'm engaged in, is what exactly was the Las Vegas Women's Christian Temperance Union all about? What were its origins? How and why did it come into being? How is it connected to the national organization? And the Women's Christian Temperance movement at the national level was huge, with hundreds of chapters all over the country in states and territories. A lot of activity in the West and Southwest, but also active in the South, the Northeast, and so on. So what were the connections there? And what were its primary activities? Again, the stereotypes we have are, again, women holding demonstrations, sort of beating drums, singing songs, or else, as in the picture on the left, engaged in direct action, actually going into saloons with axes and smashing up kegs of liquor. So what was the temperance movement and the Temperance Union here in Las Vegas all about? Was it engaged in direct action? Was it educational? Was it policy oriented, or some mixture of all of them? And what kinds of activities and achievements did the union have in the period from about the late 1880s or the mid 1880s down to at least the early 20th century. And how did it connect with the Protestant missionary movements that were active in New Mexico, and what was its role politically? One of the things that we run into when we look at the temperance movement is that it's always connected with, or mostly connected with, other political issues, in particular, the women's suffrage movement. Many of the people engaged in the Temperance Union here in Las Vegas, elsewhere in New Mexico and nationwide, were simultaneously involved in the suffrage movement. So there are connections there. I'm trying to tease out some of them. And a final question, and this is one that I'm still just trying to begin getting a handle on, is what did the majority Nuevo Mexicano population of Las Vegas think of the Temperance Union? Now, the Temperance Union nationwide and in the territory of New Mexico in the 1880s and 1890s was explicitly white, Anglo. The temperance movement made no attempt to recruit or organize Hispanics or Native Americans. In some ways, we could think of it as almost a colonial organization. White women entering into the territory and attempting to remake society along Protestant lines, without actively involving the people among whom they're living. So that's sort of the focus. And what I want to do now is to talk a little bit, very briefly, about the Temperance Union nationally, and then drill down a bit and talk about the foundation of a New Mexico chapter of the Temperance Union in 1883, and then drill down even farther and talk about Las Vegas. Okay, so where did the temperance movement come from? Well, it's part of what we might call the Second Great Awakening taking place in the 19th century, or it's a sort of later outgrowth of that. It sort of falls into somewhat the same vein as earlier movements like the abolitionist movement. And the Temperance Union, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, as a national organization, comes into being in the 1870s. By the 1870s, the Protestant churches were on the march in the West, here in Las Vegas. By 1870, Reverend John Annan and Jose Inés Perea had established the first mission school that operated here until 1896, and then moved down to Albuquerque and became the Manal School. Thomas Harwood founded the first Methodist Episcopal Church with an actual building here in Las Vegas in 1879, and both the Presbyterians and the Methodist Episcopals founded church schools with the explicit purpose of educating the Hispanic population. The missionaries coming into New Mexico in the 1870s and 1880s were reacting to what they perceived as the chaos and immorality of frontier society, and in particular, the immorality they perceived among Native Americans and the Nuevo Mexicano population. Many historians will argue that the way in which these missionaries portrayed the Hispanic and Native American population, the ways they depicted them, were intended to denigrate them and to essentially argue for their inferiority and justify maintaining control over them. Sarah Deutsch, in a famous book published in 1989, wrote, and I quote, "Foreign in language and dress, Catholic in heritage and fact, Hispanic New Mexico seemed to many Americans not harmlessly peculiar, but a threat to national unity and virtue. Such a threat created its own imperatives and demanded a second conquest. It was the Protestant churches who claimed the privilege. Anglo-Protestants spoke in one breath of Americanizing and of Christianizing New Mexico, of conquering this frontier, end quote. And so this is sort of the context for the temperance movement. Now, the national temperance movement, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was founded in 1874 in Cleveland, Ohio. And its first head was a woman named Annie Wittenmeyer. Wittenmeyer was a woman with a long track record as a fundraiser and administrator. Before and during the Civil War, she had been active, affiliated with churches, and during and after the Civil War, she had been a preeminent figure in trying to organize and fund soldiers' homes, basically institutions for the care of wounded, crippled, maimed soldiers, sort of the human remnants of the Civil War. She was also a founding member of another key institution, if we're talking about missionaries in Las Vegas, that is the Women's Home Missionary Society. This was an organization sponsored by and connected to the Methodist Episcopal Church. Its initial president was the wife of President Rutherford B. Hayes. And the Women's Home Missionary Society saw in places like New Mexico and also Indian reservations across the West, the same kind of challenges and the same kind of imperatives that missionaries going to Africa or Asia felt. And in fact, members of the Women's Home Missionary Society explicitly compared the Hispanic population of New Mexico to, in one case, Hottentots and headhunters from Africa. You get the picture. After a number of years, in 1879, control over the Women's Christian Temperance Union passed from Wittenmeyer to a woman named Frances E. Willard. And Willard would dominate the movement for the next couple of decades until her death in the late 1890s. And so for the next 2 decades, the Women's Christian Temperance movement bears kind of the imprimatur, the stamp of Frances E. Willard. And even today, among proponents of temperance, she remains a kind of heroic figure. Under Willard, the Women's Christian Temperance movement would be particularly active in the Southwest and in New Mexico and Las Vegas in particular. And Willard's point of view was that women needed to remake society and improve mankind from the top down. And this for Willard involved not just trying to keep people from drinking, but also empowering women to change society. She was, not coincidentally, an ardent advocate of women's suffrage. And so under her leadership, the two issues would become closely combined. And she was, in some ways, kind of problematic in terms of her views. But she's responsible in some ways for getting the ball rolling. In March of 1883, Willard traveled to New Mexico. And on the 21st of March, 1883, she gave a series of addresses and founded the first chapters of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in New Mexico, one in Albuquerque and one in Santa Fe. In the words of a historian who's written about the New Mexico temperance movement, she says, and I quote, "Willard began the unification of New Mexico's Protestant women for reform. She established the foundation for a middle-class Protestant women's movement. Women would agitate for social reforms within their communities to make their towns mirrors of idealized Protestant values," end quote. So this was her vision, and this was a vision that she was able to inculcate throughout the country, but throughout New Mexico and again to Las Vegas. Willard's worldview was to some degree problematic, certainly from the point of view of the non-white population of New Mexico. She saw Native Americans as, quote, essentially harmless, end quote, but she thought of Hispanics as kind of congenital drunks who, quote, were preparing for the doom of their unequal civilization, end quote. So some pretty strong opinions about the problems in Nuevo Mexicano society. And these attitudes were reflected, at least to some degree, in the territorial temperance union in New Mexico. Again, and I want to emphasize this, her vision was to have the temperance union be a colonizing force that would take control over society in accordance with essentially middle-class Protestant values. And because she dominated the movement for 2 decades, it's in this form, really, that the movement would arrive in Las Vegas. So after the foundation of those first 2 chapters, one in Albuquerque, one in Santa Fe, there was a substantial interest among, again, a certain segment of the population of East Las Vegas. And for anybody who's not familiar with the community and its history, just in passing, I will note that after the railroad arrived in Las Vegas in 1879, the town grew to the east, and East Las Vegas, the part of the town that developed on the east side of the Rio Gallinas, was Anglo Las Vegas, and the older town, the traditional Hispanic town, was on the west side. And the two towns were, there was a certain amount of friction between the two along sort of racial and cultural lines, and this friction would culminate in the foundation of 2 separate governments, so that from the end of the 19th century all the way down until 1970, East and West Las Vegas had separate governments, each with its own town council, mayor, and so on. And again, we still have a legacy of that, the fact that we still have 2 school districts here in Las Vegas, one on the east side, one on the west side. Okay, so there was interest among the Anglo-American upper middle class or middle class women in adopting temperance as a cause. Some local women were already active in the territorial temperance union by 1885, notably Reynolds, Mrs. Jefferson Reynolds. Jefferson Reynolds was a prominent businessman in East Las Vegas and also an elder of the Presbyterian Church. His wife served as the treasurer of the territorial temperance union. Another East Las Vegas native or migrant, Mrs. Ada Morley, was identified as a leading advocate in Las Vegas of the temperance movement. And so strong was that local interest that in the fall of 1885, before the foundation of a Las Vegas chapter, the Territorial Temperance Union chose to have its annual conference, its annual meeting in Las Vegas. And so on the 24th of September, 1885, women from throughout the territory congregated in Las Vegas at the Methodist Episcopal Church for the most part, and they went through a series of activities. Here's a copy of the program: devotional exercises, reading of minutes, and so on, reports from various committees and groups. And again, we can see some of the names, including Mrs. Reynolds from Las Vegas. And then in the afternoon, more kind of committee activities, and then a series of addresses, a series of speeches and lectures. Sort of the keynote speaker was a woman named Mary F. Shields, who's listed down here at the bottom of the program, Mrs. M.F. Shields, president of the Colorado Women's Christian Temperance Union. So Mrs. Shields came down from Colorado Springs and gave an address to the assembled members of the union, which was described in the Las Vegas Gazette as, and I quote, lengthy, intelligent, and very able, end quotes. Also addressing the group was Reverend S.W. Thornton, who was a Methodist Episcopal minister and the superintendent of all English language missions for the Methodist Episcopal Church in New Mexico Territory. So he is a fairly prominent individual in the Methodist Episcopal Church and also apparently a notable orator. So we have speeches, we have reports of different committees. And again, if we look at some of the names of the reports, we get some sense of the things that they're interested in. We see reports on juvenile work, evangelistic work, the Flower Mission. I still haven't been able to find out what that is. That'll be for the next talk. I'll try to report on what the Flower Missions are, perhaps. But you get a sense of the kinds of things that were going on. Anyway, as this conference closed, a call went out to have a meeting the following day on the 25th of September at the Baptist Church at 4 p.m. with the purpose of organizing a local temperance union to form a local chapter, a Las Vegas chapter of the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So with that, Las Vegas had its own chapter, and it grew rapidly. According to Lynn Perigo, within a year, they had a membership in Las Vegas of 116 people. And again, also according to Perigo, the local chapter of the temperance movement would be active well beyond 1900. In fact, it would be active at least until the 1930s. Okay, so now we have to ask ourselves, well, what did it do? So we have a local chapter of the Temperance Union here in Las Vegas. So what? What did they do? And here's where things get even more complicated. They seem to do a lot, at least for a while. And one thing we should note from the beginning is that when they talk of temperance, what we all think of what? Alcohol, right? Banning the consumption of alcohol. And that's true. That was sort of the central focus. But the temperance movement was into temperance quite broadly. That is, moderation or abstention from all kinds of harmful activities. They didn't like people to drink, obviously, but they also didn't like people to use tobacco. They didn't like people to gamble. And they had within their organization subcommittees that would deal with things like prostitution, trying to eradicate, much as the Law and Order League ladies frog marching Dallas the prostitute out of Tonto, Arizona, throwing her on the Lordsburg stage to get her out of town. And eventually the Temperance Union would also take up what is called social hygiene. Has anybody ever heard of social hygiene or wonder what that might involve? Anyone? Basically, social hygiene means any sort of practice that in the minds of the people in the organization dirties or besmirches or negatively affects society. So social hygiene can include things like, again, trying to eradicate prostitution, trying to eradicate venereal disease, but also things like eugenics. That is, trying to encourage the improvement of the race by controlling reproduction, trying to encourage fit people to have more children and to prevent people deemed unfit from having children. And eugenics was fairly widely practiced in the United States, at least up until World War II. So it's interesting that the temperance movement, at least at the national level, was interested in or engaged in those kinds of practices as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit specifically about what the Temperance Union did in Las Vegas. Throughout the decades after the founding of the group, the union sponsored meetings. Every so often, weekly or monthly, there would be meetings of the members of the union, sometimes with guest speakers to talk about the evils of drink and good ways to combat it. The local club brought in speakers from outside to talk about the temperance cause, to encourage more people to join, and so on. Women like Henrietta G. Moore of Ohio, who came to New Mexico in January of 1890 and gave a series of addresses here and elsewhere in Clayton and Raton, for example, trying to promote membership in the Temperance Union and even to create new chapters in towns where they did not exist, and trying to involve as many Protestant denominations in the movement as possible. And here in Las Vegas, we see the fruits of that quite quickly. In December of 1885, just a couple of months after the local chapter was founded, the Las Vegas Gazette reported that a temperance meeting was scheduled to be held on the night of Sunday, December 20th, at the Methodist Episcopal Church. And the topic of the meeting was to be, quote, our duty as citizens of Las Vegas in regard to the temperance question, and particularly that phase of it known as prohibition, end quote. And the congregations of not just the Methodist Episcopal Church, where the meeting was to be held, but also the Presbyterian Church, the Congregational Church, and the Baptist Church all announced that their members would be attending the meeting at the Methodist Episcopal Church, in some cases actually canceling their evening services so that the people could go to the temperance movement. Interestingly, the congregations of the two Catholic churches in Las Vegas and the Spanish language Presbyterian Church over on the west side, they were apparently not invited. So there are these meetings, lectures, presentations. Some local temperance women actually went on the road and served as apostles for temperance, going to other towns in the territory and even outside of the territory to give talks about temperance. So it's a very active chapter here in Las Vegas. And a crucial focus of their activity was the schools, in particular, the mission schools established by the Protestant denominations. And the teachers at the mission school were heavily involved in the temperance movement. They wore two hats, so to speak. They taught the local Hispanic children, but they also acted as advocates for temperance. And a great example of this is this woman, Miss Nellie Snyder, who I've talked about before. She was the source of a near riot that took place in the fall of 1901 after she published an article in a local newspaper saying a lot of disparaging things about the Hispanic population of Las Vegas. Anyway, she worked for more than a decade, about 12 years in all, as a missionary teacher for the Methodist Episcopal Church in their school that they operated in Las Vegas. So she arrived in Las Vegas in 1889, a year after the school had been founded. And for the next 12 years, she worked as a teacher. And again, the schools that the Protestant denominations operated, especially the Methodist Episcopal schools, were not first and foremost focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic. A lot of their focus was on what they called domestic arts, essentially home economics, in particular for girls. The idea was that they would prepare girls to be good wives and mothers by training them in sewing and cooking and things like that. And this was connected with the idea of temperance because, so the thinking went, you take girls and you teach them to be really great wives so that they can outfit really nice households, so that their men, their husbands, when they get married, won't think of going off to the saloons or, heaven forfend, consorting with prostitutes or anything like that, because they'll come home and their shirts will be ironed and their buttons sewn on, their meals will be cooked, and so on. So Nellie Snyder did a lot of teaching to, some reading, writing, and arithmetic, but again, a heavy focus on the domestic arts. Also, temperance education was built into the curriculum. One participant in the mission schools wrote, and I quote, "Weekly temperance lessons, Sunday school, and young people's meetings and visitations among the parents of the pupil kept the missionaries busy." Also, the Temperance Union provided material support for the mission schools. They provided them with the books necessary for teaching temperance education. In the schools, Snyder and others also focused on tobacco. They didn't want people, especially boys, to smoke either. So in 1885, right after the founding of the local union, they created an anti-cigarette league, and they recruited more than 300 local boys into this organization. They got them to pledge and actually sign a pledge saying, "I will not smoke or use tobacco." And in exchange for their pledge, they would be awarded with a badge or a pin. And they would have meetings every month, again, sort of like the parent organization, where they would have songs and music and readings and lectures on the evils of tobacco. And a council of 10 boys of this anti-tobacco league would sit in judgment on anybody who broke their promise not to smoke. They would judge them, and if they were found guilty, they would take away their pin, and they would only give it back if the person promised once again not to smoke and sort of kept their nose clean for at least 6 months. So again, we see a heavy emphasis on education, and that even extended into the jails. The temperance movement as a whole had as one of its fundamental beliefs that crime and incarceration could usually be traced in some way back to alcohol. Here's what I think is a really nice sort of cartoon called "The Drunkard's Progress from the First Glass to the Grave," showing what happened when you drank alcohol. So you start out, you have a glass with friends, and as time goes on, you get deeper and deeper into the toils of demon rum, and you start going downhill, poverty and disease, forsaken by friends. Step 8 here, desperation and crime, followed by death by suicide. So again, the temperance people believed that if you drank, you were going to end up in jail. And so they worked a lot with prisoners in the local jails, trying to get them to change their ways. Members of the local union often visited prisoners and handed out tracts and pamphlets extolling the virtues of church and home life over those of alcohol. The 1910 report of the statewide, or still the territory-wide convention, observed that, quote, "Las Vegas gives prominence to jail and prison work, distributing 100,000 pages of literature," end quote, in the jails. So again, heavy focus on education. Another approach, and this is, I guess you could say it's connected to education, was the use of pledges, getting people to promise not to drink. One of the most common techniques was to use these pledge cards. So someone would be given a pledge card and asked to fill it out. And they all have similar language, basically, that I'm going to promise that with the help of God, I'm not going to drink. And again, it gets very specific, curiously specific. I will abstain from all distilled, fermented malt liquors, including wine, beer, and cider, and to employ all proper means to discourage the use of and traffic in the same. And you would sign this and you would date it, and you would carry this around as a mark of your commitment not to drink alcohol. Okay, I've only got a couple of minutes left, and so I want to turn really quickly to a couple of other, in some ways, more tangible activities of the Temperance Union, focusing on giving alternatives to people so that they don't have to go into saloons. One of these was an ongoing effort to try to create what we might call an infrastructure of learning and to provide an alternative to saloons as places to socialize. One of these was to establish what we might call a proto-library. In 1887, the Temperance Union either presumably rented a room in one of the East Side hotels and established in this room a reading room intended for young men and even young women as an alternative to going to the saloons. This was an idea advocated by many in the temperance movement. The idea being that if people only had some place decent to go, they wouldn't go into those smelly, fumy saloons. So the idea was to set up a place where people could go and sit for an hour or two and read newspapers, read magazines, read an improving book without alcohol. So from 1887 to 1893, the union operated a reading room in one of the hotels, and they received donations of books from members of the union to support the project. Ultimately, this initiative proved impossible to sustain. In the economic downturn of 1893, the union ran out of funding. They were forced to close the reading room, so they turned over the collection of books to the city government. And if I'm not mistaken, those books served as kind of the nucleus of a community library. And eventually, with support from Andrew Carnegie, a library would be built over on the east side of town, which we still have today. Okay, finally, and really quickly, since I've talked longer than I should have, the iconic fountain. The fountain that today, if you drive down Grand Avenue, you'll see, if you're headed south on Grand, just as you get even with the Buena Vida physical therapy place, on the opposite side of the street, you'll see a sort of a postage stamp sized park and a sort of a statue of a lion surrounded by a fence. This is a drinking fountain that the Temperance Union established in 1896. And again, the idea was to provide people with an alternative to demon rum. So on the 17th of December, 1896, the fountain was formally inaugurated. At 3 p.m., a group of people gathered in the park. This included children from the public schools. This included the mayor, members of the Temperance Union, a military band, which apparently Las Vegas had at the time. So the band played music. The students from the public schools all got together and sang America. And then a Protestant clergyman, Reverend George Selby, read from scripture, gave a prayer, and then the superintendent of the Las Vegas public schools, J.A. Ward, whose wife was a member of the union, he gave a speech, and in the speech he thanked the Agua Pura Water Company, who had pledged to provide water for the fountain in perpetuity. If you go by the fountain today, you'll notice it's dry, so maybe the Agua Pura company didn't last. Anyway, after Mr. Wood made his remarks, then Mayor Olney, the mayor of the city of Las Vegas, made some remarks of his own. There were songs by the children, and the event ended. There's sort of an anticlimax at the end. The first to drink from the new fountain was the horse belonging to J.A. Caruth and family. J.A. Caruth, a member of the local establishment, his wife a member of the union. Their horse was the first to drink from the new fountain, and at least according to the optic, the horse deserved to be first. After the horse, several little girls drank from the fountain. That doesn't sound very sanitary to drink after the horse. But anyway, that was the establishment of the fountain. And again, as far as I know, it remains the most tangible evidence of the existence of the Temperance Union left in the landscape of Las Vegas. And if you look at the plinth on which the fountain lies, you'll see engraved in stone, erected by the WCTU, the Christian Temperance Union, Women's Christian Temperance Union, Las Vegas, New Mexico, the fountain. Okay, to conclude in 30 seconds, there's a lot I still don't understand about the activity of the Temperance Union. One of the questions with which I'm most interested in is how did the Hispanic population, what did they think of the union? It's hard to get a handle on that, in part because most of the Hispanic population didn't leave behind much of the paper trail. It may be possible that in rereading some of the writings of elites, people like Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca, there may be mention of the Temperance Union. I've been through La Voz del Pueblo, at least to a limited degree, the local Spanish language newspaper, and El Independiente, and there are a couple of references to the Temperance Union, sometimes pejorative, but they seem to be focused more on the national organization. So there's an article from 1910 or 1911 in which the editor of the paper asserts that the temperance movement is opposed to statehood for New Mexico, and in particular the Constitution that has just been put forth, presumably because it did not contain prohibition, as some Western state constitutions did. But that's, I think, a fertile area for further investigation. And again, I only got about 10 minutes left, and I did want to give at least an opportunity for a question or two if there are any. So I think I will stop there for now. Thanks very much for your attention. And again, I will be happy to try to field any questions people might have. Anything?
Well, I don't see anything in the chat. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments, or does anyone have any information that they might be able to provide Dr. Linder, you know, as he continues to research this subject? I know that many years ago, there was an attempt by Main Street to find the funding to preserve the fountain and bring it back to kind of its original condition as much as it could, and it was an enormous amount of money. So I don't know where that project ended up, but it's great that it's still, you know, one of the existing monuments in town, and hopefully one day, if that does come about, there will be some additional information to kind of put it into context in regards to you know, the issues that you bring up, which are extremely interesting. So.
Well, and I am finding a little bit more information. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a small grant that was announced from the Angelico Chavez Library in Santa Fe And so I decided I would apply to see if there was any, if there were any resources in the library. So I applied for the grant and looked at their online guides, to their holdings, and they had a folder, not very voluminous, but they did have a folder on the New Mexico Women's Christian Temperance Union. I applied for the grant. Didn't get the grant, but the woman with whom I dealt at the library said that since it was a relatively small volume of stuff in the file, that she could digitize it and send it to me. And so I've just started going through that. It's mostly copies of the annual, the minutes or proceedings from the annual conferences. But there are a few sort of interesting bits and pieces. There was a letter, and again, not having to do with Las Vegas necessarily, but there was a letter that was part of this group of documents from an individual in Albuquerque who, and this was in the 1940s, was advocating against the law not allowing Native Americans to buy alcohol. He said that friends of his Native Americans who were veterans of the Second World War found that they could not go into a bar in Albuquerque or Farmington or wherever and buy a drink, even though they were adults, even though, at least by the late 1940s, Native Americans could vote. Up until 1948, Native Americans could not vote in the state of New Mexico. But even veterans of the war, people who had fought for the country, were not treated as adults. And so we wrote to the head of the state temperance union and explained his frustration here. And the individual who responded said, well, I sympathize, but there must be a better approach than saying, okay, Indians can drink too, because according to this individual, at least, Indians disproportionately bore the brunt of the negative effects of alcohol. And so it's interesting that these issues were still circulating, still resonating to some degree, in the last half century at least. And again, more interesting to me, in some senses, is at least at the national level, perhaps the state level, the extent to which the Women's Christian Temperance Union seemed to have incorporated in it at least some of these elements of what today we would call white supremacy, the notion that that you would impose temperance on the Hispanic and Native American people, that you would have an organization and try to remake society, but not involve them in an active way. Just sort of come in and say, okay, for your own good, we're going to deny you from being able to drink alcohol. We're going to persuade you. We're going to cajole you. But in the last analysis, if we can, we're going to use the power of the state to control you in this regard. And again, we shouldn't forget that the temperance movement had as one of its goals leading up to the passage of the amendment that ushered in prohibition. One of their goals, and again, this is not separate from the issue of women's suffrage, to gain political power and use the power of the state to shape how people could live, to intervene in people's lives by preventing them from consuming alcohol, preventing them from using tobacco. And again, at least on the fringes, if not in the mainstream of the movement, are things like the idea of social hygiene, that is, eugenics. And, we tend to associate the idea of eugenics with the Nazis. But before World War II, and to some degree even after World War II, many states and many localities had eugenics laws on the on the books. And it was a fairly common practice in many parts of the United States in the 20th century to sterilize women of color, especially women of color who were deemed to be, in some sense, unfit or unsuitable, not to mention, the developmentally disabled, people with mental illness, things like that. So again, these are all issues that I find very interesting, and what I'm hoping to do in the next months or maybe years, depending on how much assistant dean work I have to do or associate dean work I have to do, I hope to sort of tease some of these things out and get a better sense of the articulation between the Temperance Union, these Protestant missionary groups, and the wider society that's taking shape in Las Vegas toward the end of the 19th and into the beginning of the 20th century. Anyway, thanks very much for your attention. Sorry I did my usual phenomenal job of communication to the point where I've left you with no questions.
Peter, there's somebody with their hand raised.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Rebecca.
Hi. Let me see if
Hi.
I can unraise my hand now. Thank you, Dr. Linder, for that chat. I have a very, very small comment. The series of images you had that had the progression of the first drink with friends into death by suicide, with the widow and the child like mourning over the grave. It's possible you already know this, but to me, as a scholar of 18th century British lit, I saw the immediate resonance with the Harlot's Progress and the Rake's Progress, which is a series of engravings by William Hogarth. Are you familiar with these images?
Vaguely, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So William Hogarth is a satirist, which for me is the kind of pivotal, crucial detail here. So he is explicitly satirizing in these series of images engraved in the 1730s. So the harlot is a woman who comes into the city from the country. She starts drinking, she falls into prostitution, she dies of venereal disease. And the rake similarly is the son of a wealthy, he's like this ne'er-do-well son, and he falls into drinking, prostitution, and is like dying or dead in the final scene. But again, Hogarth is like intentionally satirizing this concept of a kind of a social and physical downfall through these pursuits. So yeah, I figured you were at least vaguely aware, but I wanted to toss that out as an immediate visual echo I saw in that really engaging image.
But I'm also interested in the way in which temperance women are represented, because again, even in the the mid 20th century, they're being represented, and if we go back to the Law and Order League women in Stagecoach, they're all sort of, they're wearing heavy woolen clothing in Arizona. They've all got those, the ribbons on their breasts, and they're mostly not very attractive. And so, the message there, you sort of juxtapose them against Dallas, the beautiful prostitute. The subtext is obviously, well, these are dry old women who don't want the competition. And even in the in the Hallelujah Trail, another depiction of the temperance movement in the West, the rank and file women are all sort of the same, dour, grouchy, not concerned about their husbands and children. And then the two leaders, the soldier's daughter and then Mrs. Massengill, they're essentially dilettantes. They're upper middle class women who, don't have anything better to do. I mean, Mrs. Massengill in the film, she's twice widowed, and the colonel, whose name I can't remember, he was played by Burt Lancaster. After she says, "Well, I've had two husbands die," he says something to the effect that they were fortunate men, to have gotten away from the shrew. So, but again, you sort of see the ways in which women are depicted as somehow, by entering into the public sphere, they're leaving behind true womanhood. That true woman is the woman who stays home and nurtures the family. And to the extent that they go out and engage in public life by entering the temperance union or, God forbid, trying to get the vote, that takes them out of the role of authentic women and brings them into, again, in the one editorial, at least, they're called hermaphrodites for doing that. So that's another aspect of this that's really intriguing to me, is the way in which ideas about gender are being used politically, and how women are asserting that true womanhood can involve militancy and activity outside of the home, versus the people who say, well, no, true women stay at home, sort of in this Victorian idol where they're responsible for the upbringing of the kids and the transformation of children from savages into civilized people, and that should occupy all their time. But thanks very much for the comment. It was intriguing, and I'm going to go back and re-examine Hogarth.
Well, thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Juliet T had to run out. She's handling some other homecoming duties. So we thank you very much for your time and your expertise, and you're always fascinating no matter what you're talking about. So does anybody else have any comments? Last parting
Hi,
comment.
Ruth. Long time no see. Thanks, sweetie.
Were you talking to me?
No, my wife,
Oh.
actually. Sorry.
Just kidding. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for showing up for HU Talks, and we have a full slate of offerings for tomorrow. So please join us tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Great to see your faces.
Nice to see you, Ruth.